The night at the Hazbin Hotel was unusually quiet, save for the crackle of static that hummed through the walls. It wasn't unusual for Alastor's presence to carry its tangible presence throughout the Hazbin Hotel, but tonight it was louder. You had noticed it earlier, during dinner when Alastor sat down, unusually quiet at the table. Typically, the life of any conversation that he had been curt and his responses were clipped. His ever-present grin just were strained. His hands twitched and fingers curled like they were itching to dig into something. "Are you feeling all right?" you asked, trying to catch his gaze. "Oh, absolutely splendid," he replied, his voice a touch too loud, the static crackling audibly. "Why, I've never felt more alive." But the flicker in his crimson eyes betrayed him. Now as you stood outside his room, that same staticky buzz at the edges of your hearing, it had grown louder as the hours had passed, like a living entity pressing against your senses. Something was wrong. You raised a hand, hesitating before knocking. The air felt heavier here. It was thick with a predatory tension that made your heart race. Swallowing your nerves, you rapped your knuckles lightly against the door. "Alastor?" you say softly. "Are you in there?" For a moment there's silence. Then a low chuckle rolled from the door, muffled but unmistakably his. "Ah, my dear, always so concerned. Do come in." The invitation sent a shiver down your spine. His voice, usually smooth and warm like a vintage radio, carried an edge tonight, raw and primal. Pushing the door open, you stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, a single lamp casting a weak yellow glow. Alastor stood in the center, his back to you, his silhouette framed by the jagged shadows of his antlers. His usually pristine red suit was rumpled up, the fabric stretched and taut over his shoulders. His normally rigid posture seemed off. When the door shut behind you, his head tilted slightly, just enough for you to catch the sharp glint in his eyes. "I've been waiting for you," he purred, his voice rolling through the room like thunder. "Alastor?" You stepped closer, cautiously, your hand instinctively pressing against the wall for support. "What's going on? You've been acting like this strange all day." He turned slowly. Your breath almost caught. His grin was wilder than usual, almost unnaturally so. His eyes burned with an intensity that made your skin prickle. He looked feral. "My dear," he began, his tone dripping with exaggerated politeness. "It seems I'm experimenting something of a seasonal affection." He took a step towards you, his movements fluid yet unnervingly animalistic. What?" you echoed, confused and unease wearing within you. He chuckled. The sound was low and guttural. "Yes, a rather inconvenient little quirk of my other nature. You see, every so often the beast within me demands acknowledgement." He spreads his arms, his clawed hands flexing as though imagining them wrapped around something or someone. You froze at his words. "The beast within you." "Oh, yes," he said, his grin stretching impossibly wider. "Did you think this charming exterior was all there was to me? No, my dear. There are instincts, urges, primal desires that I cannot suppress forever." He was close now, his towering frame looming over you. His hand reached out, brushing a curl from your face. The touch was surprisingly gentle, but it sent a jolt of electricity racing through you. "Alastor, Your voice faltered as his eyes locked on yours, the intensity of them nearly overwhelming. "Hush," he murmured, his voice dropping near a growl. There's no need for you to be afraid. I would never harm you. But his grin faltered for the briefest moment, replaced by something raw and vulnerable. You must understand, tonight I am not entirely myself. What do you mean? He asked, her voice barely above a whisper. His claws grazed your cheek, the stag in the air crackling even louder. It means, he said slowly, that the part of me kept so carefully controlled is straining at the leash, and I'm not certain how long I can hold it back. Your heart pounded in your chest. What do you need me to do? The question seemed to catch him off guard. His grin softened, his expression flickering with something almost tender. Stay, he said simply. Your presence keeps me at bay. It grounds me. You nodded, though your nerves screamed at you to run. I'll stay. He stepped back slightly, his shoulders relaxing, though a great weight had been lifted. Good, he murmured, his voice laced with relief, but the primal energy in the room remained simmering beneath the surface. The energy was suffocating, thick with tension that seemed to just hum beneath your skin. Alastor paced now, his movements jittery like a predator barely restraining itself. His claws flexed at his sides, and the glow of his crimson eyes seemed to pulse at every ragged breath he took. He stayed seated on the edge of his armchair, his hands clutching the worn fabric as if it might tether you to some semblance of normalcy. But there was nothing normal about this. Alastor? He said cautiously, your voice breaking the silence. What does this rut mean for you? For us? He froze mid-step, his back to you. The sharp crackle of static that filled the room, louder now. It's like a storm brewing slowly. He turned to face you, his grin less controlled and more strained. It's rather inconvenient quirk of mine existence, my dear, he said, his voice rougher than usual. The beast within me, my more animalistic side demands release, and the seasons come, it grows relentless. He stepped closer to you. You couldn't help but shrink back slightly. I've spent years mastering myself, he continued, his voice dripping in something darker. But this, as you so probably put it, rut, is a test of my control. And you, my darling, are the catalyst. Me? You breathed it out. Of course. You are my light, my grounding force, yet you are so temptational. Alastor, you searched for the right words, but they couldn't escape you. His presence was overwhelming, a hearty mix of danger and allurance. He chuckled. The sound was low, vibrating with primal energy. There's no need to fear, my dear. I would never harm you. You must understand that my restraint is fragile tonight, though. Your breath hitched. His other hand ghosted over your cheek, his claws gazing at the skin with a surprising amount of tenderness. Then, tell me what to do, you said. You just need to stay close, he grinned. Your presence soothes the chaos, but beware, my darling, there may come a moment when the beast is too strong to control. You must decide whether to run or to face me. The weight of his words were very heavy, but you nodded, your resolve hardening despite the fear thrumming in your veins. I won't leave you, Alastor, not like this. His laughter filled the room. It was rich and dark, echoing like thunder. Oh, my sweet, brave little thing, he said, his voice dripping with admiration. Do you even know what you've signed up for? The static grew louder, partially vibrating with his energy. He sat up abruptly, towering over you. Very well, he said, his grin widening. Let us see how long we can play this game before the beast takes over. You rose to your feet. I'm not afraid of you. Alastor's grin faltered for the briefest moment, a flash of something tender and raw beneath his gaze. Oh, my darling. Perhaps, maybe you should be. The atmosphere in the room had grown suffocating, the once faint hum of static now a deafening roar in your ears. Alastor's presence was overwhelming. His crimson eyes going brighter, his movements more erratic, as he struggled against something unseen. You could see it, the way his claws clenched and twitched, the way his sharp grin strained at the corners as if the facade of control was slipping. I told you to stay, Alastor growled, his voice rebuttaling with something brittle and unhinged. But I wonder if you truly understand what that means. Your pulse quickened. I understand more than you think, you replied, trying to keep your voice steady. But you're not alone in this. Whatever's happening, we'll get through together. Such bravery. He threw back his head and laughed. But bravery doesn't mean much to a predator, my dear. Especially not when it smells so strongly of fear. For a moment, the room is silent, save for the hum of static, and without warning, Alastor froze, his head snapping towards you. His eyes glowed brighter and his grin stretched wider. You've made your choice, he said, his voice low. Now let's see if you can handle the consequences. The air of the electricity seemed to charge with an intensity that made your skin prickle and your breath hitch. Alastor stood before you, his crimson eyes glowing like empires, his grin sharp, but faltering at his internal struggle reached its peak. The static was deafening now, a low roar that seemed to echo his torment. I shouldn't, he murmured, his voice softer but twinged with that feral edge. His clawed hands hovered inches from your face, as if torn between pulling you closer and pushing you away. You're far too precious to me. You reached up, your fingers brushing against his hand. The touch was light and hesitant, but it was enough to pull his gaze back to yours. I trust you, you whispered, your voice steady despite the storm swirling within you. His grin wavered for the first time. You saw something fragile in his expression, something human beneath the monstrous facade. You shouldn't, he said, his voice barely audible. But when you didn't pull away, his resolve finally cracked. With a low growl, he closed the distance between the two of you, his hands cupping your face with a surprising amount of gentleness. His touch was warm and was discerning. The static in the air danced along your skin like a living thing. Tell me to stop, he murmured, his voice a raw whisper. I don't want you to, you replied, your heart pounding in your chest. That was all he needed. His lips crashed under your own. The kiss was intense, almost desperate, like a dam breaking after years and years of restraint. His other hand found Stella's on your waist, pulling you flush against him as the static in the room surged, wrapping around you both like a storm. You gasped in his mouth, your fingers trailing up to his disheveled hair as you kissed him back with an equal amount of favor. His grin sharp and predatory, pressing against your lips as he deepened it. His claws trailing down your back, a feather-light touch that sent shivers through you. He pulled back just enough to look at you, his crimson eyes dark with a desire, but still flickering with restraint. You have no idea what you've done to me, he murmured, his voice low and rough. Then show me, you said, your voice barely above a whisper. His laughter was soft, almost relevant. He pressed his forehead against your own. Oh, my darling, you truly are something else. Then his lips found yours again, softer this time, but no less intense. His hands explored your sides. His touch was careful, as though memorizing each curve and contour. Each brush of his claws sent sparks splattering through your skin. You melted into him, your hands tracing the sharp lines of his jaw, the curve of his shoulders that growled softly at your touch, the sound vibrating through you, leaving you breathless. For a moment, it was just the two of you. No tension, just the raw connection. When he finally pulled back, his grin was softer, but nonetheless feral. He laughed. The sound was rich as he pulled you close again, and the static in the room softened. This was going to be a very, very, very long night.